This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation.
Good day to you. My name is Kądzielska-Koper and you are watching Common Sense Generation. We talk about society, values and philosophy. With me is Henrie, president of Arthur N.Rupe Foundation. Thank you very much for coming.
It's great to be here.
You're American and we shoot it in Europe. But as you mentioned, Arthur N.Rupe is actually a Galician Jew. So it's a connection between...
Yes. Well, actually, he himself is not. He was born in America, but his parents were from Galicia.
So there is this urge to preserve certain values, which comes from both.
Well, I should actually say he only passed away in 2022. He was 104 years old. And as a man of that age, he was, let's just say, in many ways more old-fashioned in his values than the way the society had gone. So he reflected the sort of the golden age values of America very well.
I understand. We're talking about common sense. Common sense as a value and as a virtue. What is for you common sense?
I think common sense is a short answer, but might be what your grandmother told you. Because I think that there is in folk wisdom a lot of wisdom. And I think that's, I think we should never forget that. And I think that there is a tendency of intellectuals, or the intelligentsia, to heighten their conflict with common sense. Because there's a certain kind of vanity in intellectuals. You don't get any honor for coming up with an idea that's the same as what your grandmother told you. You come up with, you're honored as an intellectual with coming up with something very ingenious that seems to support or require something completely different of anything your grandmother would ever be caught dead advocating. And I think that this is something to be wary of. I think that the English historically are very good because they trust common sense and they look with suspicion on intellectuals. And that's why the Tory party, for example, has never really been able to have any theory about what it means to be a Tory because they are theoretical. They don't believe in theory. Theory will mislead you. And so they trust common sense instead. And I think that that's actually a very powerful, wise, stable, prudent way of thinking, to be suspicious of whatever your grandmother would be suspicious of. And then seek intellectuals who can make more developed arguments against those intellectuals that are objecting to common sense. And so a lot of the work that conservative intellectuals do is they tear down the arguments of those who, on the left, who are advocating for some bizarre utopia or some bizarre divergence from common sense. And that's sort of that's the work of a conservative intellectual. But I think that for most people, most of the time, actually, they kind of know what common sense is and they should follow it.
It comes from this intuition, I think, that when we check certain ways of life of resolving problems and we check them as a society, as a group, as a majority of people, maybe not majority of people, but a lot of people, generations, then other generations already checked that something worked and something didn't work. And even though we can oppose it, but in certain levels they definitely were right, but just because of the more practice, they were being able to check it on. But through this creating this video podcast, I came across into a sort of statement that the common sense is also certain courage that when you have your intuition, or when you have your intellectual judgment of a situation, that you should behave in this or not that way, then what you also need is this element of courage to follow it, even oppose the political hierarchy of the hierarchy of power which might surround you. And a great example, I would say, the awakening we had during, of course, COVID pandemic, when certainly sort of rules came up which were absolutely absurd, and those who saw it and at least in their everyday life tried to avoid it, they very often were at least saved from some troubles. But then when we saw the paradox of when there is a threat, something which we didn't resolve for a long time, like a pandemic, and then we don't have a common way to deal with it.
That's actually. Let me get back to the COVID situation, if we do get back to the COVID situation in a minute. I wanted to give another example of ideology versus common sense. So sometimes I talk about liberal modernity or modern liberalism as sort of the dominant ideology of all modern Western nations. And that's Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, the idea of a social contract where rights are respected after you leave the state of nature. If you've studied any of that in school, that there's a whole political philosophy about that. And a lot of what we in America think of as what our rights are depends on that story. But here's a problem that emerges from that. There aren't any children in the state of nature. In this account of an original position, there's no account of how children arise and what they need. And there's not an account of how men and women come together. There's not an account of what results from that. And there's no account of how many years it takes before it's just, there are a bunch of people in the state of nature.
A theoretical concept.
Right, and they have interests, and sometimes they conflict. They have this problem. So in this theoretical account, all that exist are individuals. The individuals don't have sex; they're not a male or female, and they don't seem to reproduce. They're just there. But of course, it turns out that we reproduce. It turns out that we do that through families. It turns out that in order for the reproduction to happen, it has to be a man and a woman. It can't be two men or two women, because that's how it works. And it turns out that growing up for 18 years or whatever in the family of a certain family has an effect on you and who you are. And it turns out if your parents speak Polish rather than English, chances are you'll speak Polish. So there are many things about the very center of all human societies, the reproduction of the society by having a next generation, that are just not of interest to the social contract tradition and the state of nature, which is classical liberalism. And so in a sense, the classical liberal theorists are smart intellectuals, but there's this gigantic hole in their theory. And I think that your grandmother knew a lot more about that, what's in that hole, and that's where the common sense comes in. And so you need to sort of be able to see what's missing. And that's, again, the job of the conservative intellectuals, to see what's missing and to be able to describe the effects of what happens when you miss that part.
You miss that part, and this is this part between this, as you mentioned, the utopia as certain groups wants to create, and the reality which always somehow comes to being, that it is out there, and we have to respect the rules of it. And of course, it's the question of objectivism. Do we see this objective reality? But on the other way, what at the end is always objective is the fact of the death of people. And this is the sphere of the death is also something which comes to the mind of every citizen, of every human being.
Well, and let me the more I think about it,
yes.
now, with your questions, is the generation of human beings through a family is really at the heart of, I think, everything that the more conservative people are concerned about in the contemporary world. Because if you think about it, the religion, for example, is something that matters. Religion descends through families. If you are a religious family, you raise your children in a religious way. And you know that you have to, because the children will ask questions that you will answer. They'll ask questions again. You'll keep asking questions, and in answering their questions about normative things, the ought you to do this, ought you not to do that. Ultimately, it does come down to God. And so you need to be able to answer questions of that kind, down to the bottom. And so how religion interacts with the raising of children is a key question that the secular liberals think we don't need that. We shouldn't support that. They should be free to decide on their own when they're 18, something of that kind. So religion is implicated in the generations. With the generations, you look back to your ancestors. So the questions about pride in national history, on the one hand, or shaming and dishonoring of national history by others on the other hand. So the conservatives want to take pride in their descent from their ancestors, and the left wants to cut us off from the ancestors, and therefore tries to shame the crimes of our ancestors. And then of course the controversies surrounding sexualities and genders is also central to whether there can be children. Also, whether there's to be immigrants, because if you bring in immigrants, then your children will inherit a different world, a different society. And so if you want to have continuity to your children so that their world can be fairly similar to the world that you grew up in, the immigrants are a problem. And then similarly, the demographic problem is that should we be concerned that we're not having enough children? If this is the central aspect of human life, the descent of the generations,
absolutely,
then we should. But the liberals don't care. They'll come from somewhere. People.
Yes, I think this is this huge battle, the battle of freedom, even gender ideology, the battle of all LGBT groups. After all, the outcome is, of course, ultimate freedom in every form, in every aspect. But when you give this ultimate freedom, they don't see the important issue of this, that all of those statements and ways of life which you're representing lead to the fact that those groups have no children. And so far their life and all of those what they fought for ends with them. And that's the point, that's the spirit. And who survives? Everyone with more traditional values, who had children.
And I think that you can think, for example, of these two positions are offering two proposals for the best way of life. So one proposal for the best way of life is there was a television show maybe 10 years ago or more in America, which is probably in Poland as well, called Sex in the City.
Absolutely.
It was about young women and then not so young women who would never marry and never have children. And that was the best life. That's a proposal. This is the best life, to be free, from obligations, especially the obligation of children, to have a lot of money and to go to have brunch. And,
Yes,
and
enjoy
and
fashion.
to have sex with whoever I want, whenever I want.
With whomever I want.
Yeah, but not with any children involved. That's a proposal for the best way of human life. That's the proposal for what should be honored in the society. The conservatives want instead to honor the traditional family, or raising, parents working hard and raising children, a rich world of profound relationship, of new generation, and hard work and loyalty and commitment, which means that you sacrifice other opportunities, that is to be honored. And I think that and that's what we hold forward as the best way of life. And I think that that's in a sense, that's what the modern world has to decide. Am I going to take that option or this option? And it's obvious that the Sex and the City option seems to be attractive to many people. But I think it's only attractive to people in the short run. I think that over the course of a whole human life, the people who go down that path begin to have regrets later on. Whereas I don't know anybody who is married, has children, and then the grandchildren come along, who ever regrets that. I mean, it's like, this is great. Now the grandchildren are here, and it's been tough. But now I got grandchildren, and there's no regrets there.
But there isn't this battle between two forms of immortality. One form of immortality is, of course, through our actions, what we do, what we have achieved, what we have produced, what we have created, and what we have accumulated, what we have built. And of course, there is power, there's beauty in it, there is, we can fulfill our passions in it. But of course, the other form of immortality is through our ancestors, through our children, respecting our ancestors, having our children. This is the way of life and the biological immortality. And when those two coexist together, and they of course can coexist together to a certain extent, and with, of course, certain sacrifice, but they can. But if we add the value of freedom as an ultimate value, and not as of an element who creates a space for those two to exist, then we have this dictatorship of an individual. And this leads, of course, that it ends with the life of an individual.
Well, and I have to say that it's when I hold it out as pick one or the other, it's not like we're going to put the Sex and the City people in concentration camps. We live in free societies. The basic freedom of the free society will continue. People will be able to choose that life. However, I think that there are public policies that can be pursued which might support and do more honor to those who pursue the life of family raising. And I would say also, by the way, that whatever achievements you think you'll have in life, if you write a great novel, all of those achievements are mortal. There will come a time even if it's a great novel, in 100 years, no one will remember it. Certainly within 500 years, no one will remember it.
Unless you're really
really good. But if you're a believing Christian, you believe that every human being is immortal, and so if you have a family and you have children, you've created more immortal things. You've created immortal things. You have something immortal and that's amazing.
And that's amazing, and seeing it through, absolutely. I experienced the beauty of motherhood, and I would say there's nothing else which really would fill this void in us, which is in every human being, is of course the void which, as St. Augustine said, is this hour that we miss God, and somehow through having children we are closer to God. I don't know how to explain it, but maybe this part of us, which is part of God in our souls, is just cherish the fact that we pass the life on. I think those two we touched a lot of topics, all connected with something. But I would like to ask you about one intuition of you, and this is something which I struggled for a long time already. Are people born liberal, left-wing, and born conservative, or it comes through education and a way of life? Because we face the same families, the same upbringing, which produce a different mentality, and very often we have an example of people who come from the same families, but they have such opposed ways of seeing it. And of course, this left wing of saying very often comes from this utopia, then you can change the human being, that you can make the paradise here on earth. When of course the conservative way of approach is you cannot make a paradise here on earth. You can make a life good enough, but a paradise is something which awaits us in the afterlife.
So you're saying, are you born liberal and conservative, or does something else happen?
Because I myself, I don't know.
I don't think you're. Well, there are. So okay, they say that liberals are characterized by the psychological trait of greater openness, openness to new experience, whereas conservatives are more fearful or distrusting of new experience. They prefer to be well settled, so if that's what you mean by conservative and liberal, then that probably is a biological fact of who you are. But
there is one. There's one compound of aesthetic in it as well, that conservatives tend to, of course, cherish more order and art and beauty in way of clothing, in way of eating, when liberals very often goes from more to cherish the chaos, which is of the underdress, of absolute freedom of how you express yourself, but also of this chaos and lack of order in forms of art, beauty, surroundings, buildings, food, way of life.
Well, what I think I would say there is that if you are somebody who has greater openness, or that's your psychological trait, is openness to new things, one of two things can happen to you. Either you can then be drawn to heady ideas, like, oh, this is an interesting idea. And it turns out the left has many interesting ideas. There are crazy ideas, but if you're interested in ideas and new crazy ideas are what you really like, you will be drawn there. But you could have a brother who's also highly open, interested in new ideas, and he sees these left-wing ideas, but then for some strange reason, he also learns about conservative thinkers, and he goes, wait, this is even more interesting, because there's so much of that, the left ideas, but it's hard to find this other stuff, and that's more interesting because it's hard to find, it's rare. And so there would be two people with the same character traits, but something about their life leads them in different directions. So I don't think you're born one or the other. I think that there are, as it were, liberal-minded or open-minded conservatives who end up being quite intellectual. They end up being the conservative intellectuals. And then there's just people who are, sensible and commonsensical.
I can tell you what brought me eventually more to a conservative way of life and approach, because most of us, when we are young, we have this intuition of, we see the injustice which surrounds us, that certain people have more than others have less, that there is some injustice and it touches people. There are those who are extremely poor, they need help. But then I realized I'm not able to change the whole world. I'm not able to change every injustice, order, or every situation in a society, in any society in the world. And I came to a conclusion that what I can really change is myself, my way of life, my approach to things. And if it changed anything, that it changed my family and people who I communicate with. And this after all comes to a conservative way of doing things, that you create either your small world around you, or you're full with your values and something which you cherish. And the other way is that you work on yourself, and to this extent that you can be a role model, that you're bringing this world wherever you go or whoever you meet.
You know that G.K. Chesterton wrote a book entitled "What's Wrong with the World," and the final answer was, "I am." So I have to fix myself, and that's about all I can really fix. But I think other than that, what I would say is that the American writer George Will once used to focus on the fact that the thing which makes people conservative is having children, because until you have children, you're responsible for the world. You care what's happening in Darfur. You care what's happening everywhere. Every injustice in the world matters to you. Once you have a child, that's what matters to you. And it matters who lives on your street. It matters what the school is like, where he goes to school. It matters if the playground is safe. Very, 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 very particular things matter. And who has time for Darfur? And so
absolutely agree.
And so that is the moment that makes you conservative. Now, and from that point on, you're essentially a serious person. Because the person who is thinking about Darfur, what are you gonna do about Darfur? The answer is nothing. But you're gonna sound smart because you're worried about Darfur, like they tell you should be worried about. So a serious person is a person who has responsibility for something real in the world, and their child is very real, and his environment is a real world, and that is the beginning of conservatism, I think, in many modern people's lives. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons why conservatism maybe is not doing as well in modern societies as it might. And the answer is because fewer people are marrying at all. If they do marry, they're marrying later. If they are marrying later, they may not have children. And so that normal generation, the transition or the transfer of one generation to the next has broken down. And so I think that's the central, or is breaking down. And that's the central issue, really, for all of our societies, is that what's normal, and the most normal thing in the world, has begun to unravel and needs to be fixed. And the conservatives recognize this and want to have everybody in public life thinking about how to fix that, whereas the left or the liberals say, well, who's to say that it's better to get married and have children? That's maybe your opinion, but there are other opinions, and everyone's free to do whatever they want to do. And if there's no new generation, we'll have immigrants instead. And they basically are giving in to the dissolution of their society, to the complete breakdown of the transmission of the society.
And this is the punchline of our interview. Mark, again, thank you very much for sharing those with me and having all of this intellectual exchange. I enjoyed it very much. And I do hope that our viewers also enjoyed it and they liked it. There are, I think, two things important. One is that having children is an element how to preserve yourself and the society, and it's something which makes you conservative. And the other thing is this: rather change yourself than change the society. Thank you very much for watching Common Sense Generation, and I thank Polish National Foundation for making this video podcast possible.
This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation.